A 9-year-old boy in a small village in Surrey, England, has just been told a secret. The woman he calls his sister is actually his mother. The couple he calls his parents are actually his grandparents. His real father, a Canadian soldier, left before he was born and never came back. The boy goes quiet. He stops doing well in school. He pulls away from everyone around him. He doesn't know who he is anymore. That boy would grow up to be called God. Literally. Spray-painted on the walls of London. He'd sell over 100 million records. He'd win 18 Grammy Awards. He'd be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame 3 separate times, the only person in history to achieve that. But he'd also fall in love with his best friend's wife. He'd spend $16,000 a week on heroin. He'd lose his 4-year-old son in a way that no parent should ever have to imagine. And out of that unthinkable grief, he'd write one of the most devastating songs ever recorded. By the end of this video, you'll understand how Eric Clapton survived everything that should have destroyed him, and why his greatest gift was never his guitar. It was his refusal to stop getting back up. This is a story about redemption, and it starts with a lie told to a child. Eric Patrick Clapton was born on March 30th, 1945, in the village of Ripley, Surrey. His mother, Patricia Molly Clapton, was 16 years old. His father, Edward Walter Fryer, was a 24-year-old Canadian soldier stationed in England during the final months of World War II. Fryer played piano and sang in local pubs to earn extra money. He met Patricia one night at a Surrey pub. She got pregnant. And before the baby arrived, Fryer shipped back to Canada, where he already had a wife. In 1940s England, an unmarried 16-year-old with a baby was a scandal. So Patricia's mother, Rose, and her stepfather, Jack Clapp, made a decision. They'd raise the boy as their own. They'd tell him Patricia was his older sister, and they'd give him the last name Clapton, from Patricia's biological father, Reginald Cecil Clapton, who'd long since left the family. For 9 years, Eric believed the lie. He had a roof over his head. His grandmother Rose played piano. Music filled the house, but something always felt slightly wrong, slightly off, as if the world was built on a foundation that could crack at any moment. It cracked when Eric was 9. Patricia came to visit, bringing along a 6-year-old boy, Eric's half-brother. His grandmother finally told him the truth. Patricia wasn't his sister. She was his mother. Eric later recalled that his uncle Adrian used to jokingly call him a little bastard. The boy eventually realized his uncle was telling the literal truth. After the revelation, Eric changed. He grew sullen. He pulled inward. He became what he later called a nasty kid. School lost its appeal. He felt like he didn't belong anywhere. The one thing he'd been sure of, his family, turned out to be a fiction. But there was one thing that didn't lie to him. One thing that sounded the same every time he picked it up. A guitar. At 13, Eric received an acoustic guitar for his birthday. He found it nearly impossible to play. The strings bit into his fingers. The chord shapes felt unnatural. His hands cramped. He almost quit. He didn't quit. But here's what's important. He didn't pick up the guitar because he had natural talent. He picked it up because he needed it. There's a difference. Talent is a gift. Need is survival. For a kid who just discovered that his entire identity was a lie, who felt like he didn't belong in his own family, the guitar became the one thing that was entirely his. Nobody gave it to him as part of a deception. Nobody took it away. Instead, he discovered the blues. Not the watered-down British version playing on the radio. The real thing. Robert Johnson, Muddy Waters, B.B. King, Big Bill Broonzy, Howlin' Wolf. These were voices from the American South, singing about pain and loneliness, and the feeling that the world doesn't have a place for you. They sang about being abandoned, about being broke, about wanting something you can't have. For a kid in Surrey whose whole childhood had just been rewritten, those songs felt like the first honest thing he'd ever heard. Eric became obsessed. He practiced for hours, until his fingertips bled and hardened into calluses. He studied every lick on every Robert Johnson record he could find, rewinding and replaying passages until he could match them note for note. He dropped out of Kingston College of Art after being kicked out for spending more time playing guitar than studying stained glass design. He busked on streets around London and the West End, playing blues to passers-by who mostly walked right past. He didn't care. He was building something, note by note, that the world hadn't heard yet. In 1963, at 18, he joined the Yardbirds. They were a rising rhythm and blues band, and Eric's guitar playing immediately set them apart. For 2 years, the band grew in reputation. But in 1965, the Yardbirds recorded a song called For Your Love. It was catchy. It was commercial. It became a hit. Eric hated it. To him, the song was a betrayal of the blues, so he did something almost unheard of for a 20-year-old musician. He quit a successful band on principle. Think about what that decision says about him. Most young musicians would kill for a hit single. Eric walked away because the hit didn't sound like the truth. He'd already learned as a child what happens when people build things on lies. He wasn't going to do it with music. That stubbornness should have ended his career. Instead, it created a legend. After leaving the Yardbirds, Eric joined John Mayall's Bluesbreakers. This was the opposite of commercial music. Mayall was a blues purist who ran his band like a graduate seminar in American roots music. Eric spent his downtime in Mayall's attic, absorbing the band leader's enormous vinyl collection. Record after record, style after style. The Bluesbreakers album they recorded together, released in July 1966, became the most important British blues record of its era. Eric played a 1960 Gibson Les Paul through a cranked Marshall amplifier, and the resulting tone, thick, overdriven, sustaining for days, redefined what a rock guitar could sound like. The album was nicknamed the Beano album because Eric was reading a Beano comic on the cover. And then the graffiti appeared, spray-painted on a wall in Islington, North London, 3 words that would follow Eric Clapton for the rest of his life. Clapton is God. He never asked for it. He never believed it. Years later, he said he was embarrassed by it, that people were being exposed to another kind of music and giving him credit as if he'd invented the blues. But the myth was loose now, and it was about to get much, much bigger. Before the Bluesbreakers album even hit the shops, Eric had already left to form something new. Drummer Ginger Baker had approached him with a vision for a power trio, the biggest group in the world, anchored around 3 virtuoso musicians. Eric suggested bassist Jack Bruce, who'd briefly played in the Bluesbreakers. Baker didn't want Bruce. The two had a history of personal conflict stretching back to the Graham Bond organization. But Eric insisted. He wouldn't join without Jack. Baker agreed, and Cream was born. The band that many consider rock's first supergroup released 3 studio albums in just over 2 years. They sold 15 million records. Their concerts became legendary for ferocious blues-based improvisation that stretched songs to 20-30 minutes. Sunshine of Your Love, White Room, Crossroads, these weren't just hits. They were declarations that a 3-piece band could make more noise than an orchestra. But Cream was also a war zone. Bruce and Baker fought constantly, a feud that predated the band and never cooled. Eric felt trapped between 2 warring egos. The music got louder. The stacks of Marshall amplifiers multiplied. What had started as a blues trio became an arms race of volume and fury. By 1968, Eric announced the band was breaking up due to a loss of direction. They played their farewell concerts at the Royal Albert Hall in London that November. Cream lasted barely 2.5 years. In that time, they changed the course of rock music, and Eric walked away from it all at 23. He tried again almost immediately. Blind Faith, a supergroup with Baker, Steve Winwood, and Rick Grech, formed in 1969. They played 1 massive concert in Hyde Park, released 1 album, and dissolved within months. Eric was searching for something. He didn't know what it was. He'd stripped away the Yardbirds because they were too commercial. He'd stripped away Cream because it was too loud. He stripped away Blind Faith because it was too much pressure. What he really wanted was to disappear, to stop being the center of attention, to play guitar as part of something where nobody knew his name. That desire led him to Derek and the Dominoes, and to the worst heartbreak of his life. Eric Clapton and George Harrison became friends in the mid-1960s, 2 of the greatest guitarists alive, bonded by music and a genuine warmth for each other. Eric even played the iconic guitar solo on the Beatles' While My Guitar Gently Weeps at Harrison's invitation. They shared a rare acoustic guitar, a 1913 Gibson-style O archtop they nicknamed Pattie, which Harrison used to write Here Comes the Sun, and Eric used to write Let It Rain. That's how close they were. That's how intertwined their lives became. Then Eric fell in love with George's wife. Pattie Boyd was a model and actress who'd met Harrison on the set of A Hard Day's Night in 1964. They married in January 1966. She was beautiful, bright, and by the late 60s, increasingly neglected as Harrison dove deeper into meditation, Eastern philosophy, and long periods of spiritual isolation. Eric started visiting their home more often. He tried to hide his feelings. He even briefly dated Pattie's sister Paula, as if proximity might cure the obsession. It didn't. If anything, being near Pattie without being able to tell her the truth made everything worse. His feelings grew until they consumed him. He drew inspiration from the story of Layla and Majnun, a 7th-century Persian tale about a poet driven to madness by his love for a woman he can never have. The parallels were almost too obvious. A man slowly losing his mind. A love that society forbids. An obsession that burns through everything else in his life. Eric formed Derek and the Dominoes in 1970, partly to hide behind a group identity. He later admitted the whole band was a disguise. "We were a make-believe band," he said. "We were all hiding inside it. And from inside that disguise, he channeled everything. The longing, the guilt, the desperate need for a woman married to his closest friend, into a double album called Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs." The title track is 7 minutes of raw confession. Duane Allman's slide guitar dueling with Eric's screaming electric lines. Then a piano coda so heartbreaking it almost makes you forget how much pain created it. Pattie Boyd later said it was the most incredible song she'd ever heard. But she didn't leave George. Not yet. And Eric, rejected, fell into the darkest period of his life. Here's the thing you need to understand about Eric Clapton's relationship with Pattie Boyd. It wasn't a simple love triangle. George Harrison later said he had no problem with it. He said he and Pattie should have split much sooner. He said he still loved Eric. The three of them remained connected in ways that defied normal rules of friendship and betrayal. Pattie became the muse for both artists simultaneously. Harrison wrote Something About Her. Clapton wrote Layla, Bell Bottom Blues, and later Wonderful Tonight, all about the same woman. Pattie and George divorced in 1977. She and Eric married in Tucson, Arizona in 1979. That marriage would last 10 years before ending in 1989. But by then, the damage Eric inflicted on himself had nothing to do with love. It had everything to do with what he'd been putting into his veins. Eric Clapton's heroin addiction began in the early 1970s. After the Layla album and Pattie's rejection, he retreated from public life almost entirely. He described it as an exile. For roughly 3 years, he barely left his Surrey estate. He didn't tour. He barely recorded. He was spending, by his own account, $16,000 a week on heroin. The scale of that number is hard to grasp. In early 70s money, it was an astronomical sum. He was burning through his fortune, one fix at a time, alone in a house that was falling apart around him. His friends tried to intervene. Pete Townsend of The Who organized a comeback concert at the Rainbow Theatre in London in January 1973 to pull Eric back into performing. It worked, temporarily. Eric showed up. He played. But he wasn't clean. He reportedly passed out on stage during George Harrison's concert for Bangladesh. The man the world called God couldn't stay conscious through a charity show. What happened next is a pattern that addiction specialists will recognize immediately. Eric kicked the heroin, but he replaced it with alcohol and cocaine. He traded one prison for another. He later said this wasn't a recovery, it was a transfer. For the rest of the 1970s and into the early 1980s, Eric was a functioning alcoholic. He toured, he recorded, he released albums. Songs like Cocaine, a J.J. Cale cover that became one of his biggest hits, played on stage while Eric was consuming enormous quantities of the drug himself. He once performed an entire concert lying flat on his back because he was too drunk to stand up. He later said it didn't seem outlandish at the time. That was probably all he was capable of. In his autobiography, Eric wrote one of the most devastating sentences you'll ever read about addiction. He said the only reason he hadn't committed suicide was that he knew, if he were dead, he wouldn't be able to drink anymore. Let that sit for a moment. The man the world called God couldn't find a reason to live beyond the next bottle. In January 1982, Eric checked himself into the Hazelden Treatment Center in Minnesota. He later described it with brutal honesty. He said he drank and drank and drank in the days before entering, and they had to practically carry him into the clinic. He detoxed. He attended meetings. He got sober. and then he relapsed. The sobriety didn't hold. The old patterns returned. But something else was changing. In 1985, Eric performed at Live Aid, the worldwide charity concert, and found a new audience. His playing was sharper, more focused. Albums like August and Journeyman showed he still had the creative fire. But behind the scenes, the battle continued. It took a second trip to rehab, reportedly in 1987, before sobriety finally held. This time, Eric committed fully to the 12 steps of Alcoholics Anonymous. He said he had no more reservations about why he was there. He'd tried to control his drinking and failed. There was no more debate, no more gray area. And this time, something else was different. He had a reason beyond music, beyond fame, beyond Pattie. His reason was a little boy. Connor Clapton was born in 1986 to Eric and Italian actress Lori Del Santo. Eric wasn't married to Lori. He was still technically married to Pattie Boyd. The relationship was complicated, but Connor's arrival changed Eric in a way nothing else had. He later said Connor was the main reason he got and stayed sober. He couldn't stand being around his own son while drunk or high. For the first time, Eric had something to protect that was more important than his own self-destruction. He threw himself into fatherhood. He took Connor on outings. On March 19, 1991, Eric picked up his 4-year-old son for their first solo excursion together. They went to the circus at Nassau Coliseum on Long Island. Connor talked excitedly about the clowns and the elephants. That night, Eric told Lori that he intended to be a better, more present father. The next morning, March 20th, 1991, Eric was at a nearby hotel, getting ready to pick up Connor for lunch and a visit to the Central Park Zoo. The phone rang. Lori was on the other end, hysterical. A janitor had been cleaning the windows of Lori's 53rd floor apartment in Manhattan. He'd left a bedroom window open. Connor ran toward it. In a single, incomprehensible moment, the 4-year-old fell 49 stories. Eric later said he went cold. He shut down completely. He said the first thing he did was ask if it was really true. He couldn't let himself believe it. The details are almost unbearable. A janitor had been cleaning the apartment that morning and left a 6-by-4-foot bedroom window open. Connor ran past before anyone could stop him. New York law at the time required window guards in apartment buildings, but a 1984 ruling had exempted condominiums, leaving the decision to building owners. This window had no guard. Eric had been staying at a nearby hotel. He was literally getting dressed to go pick up his son for lunch and a trip to the Central Park Zoo when the phone rang. Connor was buried at St. Mary Magdalene Church in Ripley, Surrey, the same village where Eric was born, just steps from the house where he'd grown up believing a lie about his own mother. The funeral was small, private. The grief was not. And then, days after the burial, a letter arrived at Eric's London home. It was from Connor. The boy had written it before the accident, with help from his mother. Lori later said Connor had asked, "Mommy, what should I write to Daddy?" She told him to write what he felt. The letter said, "I love you, Dad." Eric received it after the funeral, after his son was already gone. In the weeks after Connor's death, Eric did something that defied everything anyone expected. He didn't relapse. He didn't pick up a bottle. He didn't disappear. He picked up a guitar. Working with songwriter Will Jennings, Eric wrote Tears in Heaven. The song was originally intended for the soundtrack of a 1991 film called Rush, but it became something much larger. A quiet, acoustic ballad built around a question so simple it breaks you apart. Would you know my name if I saw you in heaven? Eric later said he'd used music as a healing agent almost subconsciously, and it worked. The song asked the question he couldn't answer. Whether we meet the people we've lost, whether love survives death, whether a father can hold his son again. In January 1992, Eric recorded the song for the MTV Unplugged series at Bray Film Studios in Windsor, England. The performance was intimate, restrained, almost whispered. He sat with an acoustic guitar in front of a small audience and sang with a vulnerability that stripped away every layer of rock star mythology. No distortion, no volume, just grief, shaped into melody. The Unplugged album became the best-selling live album of all time, moving 26 million copies worldwide. At the 35th Grammy Awards in 1993, Eric won 6 awards in a single night, including Record of the Year, Album of the Year, and Song of the Year. He'd been famous for decades. He'd been called the greatest guitarist alive. But Tears in Heaven reached people who'd never heard of the Yardbirds, or Cream, or Derek and the Dominoes. It reached anyone who had ever lost someone and wondered if the pain would ever become bearable. Eric rarely performed the song in the years that followed. It remained too raw. But the act of writing it, of turning private agony into something shared, may have saved his life. And it planted a seed for something bigger. In 1998, Eric Clapton opened the Crossroads Center on the island of Antigua. It was a rehabilitation facility for people struggling with drug and alcohol addiction, built on the 12-step model that had saved his own life. Here's what made it different. 1/3 of the beds were reserved for people from the Caribbean who couldn't afford treatment. Eric didn't just build a celebrity rehab. He built a place where the poorest people in the region could get the same help that had been available to a rock star. To fund the center, he started auctioning his guitars. In 1999, he sold 100 guitars at Christie's in New York, including Brownie, the Fender Stratocaster he'd used to record Layla. The auction raised nearly $5 million. He later launched the Crossroads Guitar Festival, a recurring benefit concert featuring some of the greatest guitarists in the world, held every few years in the United States. Jeff Beck, B.B. King, Buddy Guy, John Mayer, Carlos Santana, they all showed up. Since its founding, the Crossroads Center has treated over 6,000 people. Think about that arc. The man who once said he only stayed alive so he could keep drinking was now building treatment centers and auctioning his most prized instruments to help strangers get sober. He was giving away the guitars that made him famous to save people he'd never meet. The man who needed saving became the man doing the saving. Through the 2000s and 2010s, Eric kept recording and touring. He returned to his blues roots with From the Cradle in 1994, an album of pure blues covers that reminded the world where he'd started. He paid tribute to Robert Johnson, the artist who'd first inspired him as a teenager, with Me and Mr. Johnson in 2004. He reunited Cream for 4 shows at the Royal Albert Hall in 2005, 37 years after the band's farewell concerts at the same venue. Baker and Bruce showed up. They played. For a few nights, it was 1968 again. They added 3 more shows at Madison Square Garden that October. He launched a second career composing film scores, winning a BAFTA for his work on the Edge of Darkness soundtrack. He found a new audience through his performance at Live Aid in 1985. He settled into annual residencies at the Royal Albert Hall that became events unto themselves, some of the most coveted tickets in London every year. And through it all, he never stopped giving back. The Crossroads Guitar Festivals became legendary gatherings. Jeff Beck, B.B. King, Buddy Guy, John Mayer, dozens of the world's greatest guitarists showed up to play because Eric asked them to, and because every dollar went to helping people recover from the same disease that nearly killed him. His body began to slow down. In 2013, he was diagnosed with peripheral neuropathy, a condition that causes pain and numbness in his hands and feet. For a guitarist, it's a nightmare diagnosis. He kept playing. He kept touring. He adapted his technique and his set lists. In 2026, at 81 years old, he was still performing warm-up shows in Guildford, England, preparing for another tour. Pattie Boyd attended one of those concerts. 37 years after their divorce, she posted on social media that it was great to hear Layla and Wonderful Tonight live again. Some circles never fully close. Some stories never fully end. 18 Grammy Awards, the only triple inductee in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, honored as a member of the Yardbirds, as a member of Cream, and as a solo artist, an estimated 100 million records sold. And beyond the numbers, a catalog of songs that map the entire range of human pain and survival. So here's the question this whole story has been building toward. How did Eric Clapton survive everything that should have destroyed him? An abandoned childhood, an identity built on a lie, the guilt of falling in love with his best friend's wife, 3 years lost to heroin, a decade lost to alcohol, the death of the child who gave him a reason to live. Any one of those should have been enough to finish him. Most people don't survive one. Eric survived them all. The answer isn't talent. Talent doesn't save you from heroin. It doesn't keep you sober after your son falls from a 53rd floor window. Talent gives you a gift. It doesn't tell you what to do with the pain. The answer is the thing Eric discovered at 13, sitting alone in his grandparents' house in Ripley, struggling with an acoustic guitar that hurt his fingers. He discovered that music doesn't lie. It doesn't pretend your mother is your sister. It doesn't leave before you're born. It doesn't break promises. Every time life destroyed something, Eric turned to the guitar and rebuilt. Not perfectly, not cleanly, with scars showing, with mistakes embedded in the mortar, but rebuilt, all the same. Layla was Heartbreak, turned into a 7-minute guitar odyssey. Tears in Heaven was grief turned into a whispered question. Wonderful Tonight was the quiet moment between storms. Each song was a piece of wreckage transformed into something beautiful. He didn't play faster than everyone else. He played with a weight that nobody else carried. Remember that 9-year-old boy in Ripley? The one who just found out his whole life was a lie? He spent the rest of his life searching for the things that lie had taken away. A family, a home, love, peace, some kind of identity that didn't crumble when you touched it. Sometimes he found those things. Sometimes he destroyed them himself. He hurt people. He hurt himself. He made choices that no amount of talent can excuse. But every single time the world knocked him flat, he reached for the same thing he'd reached for at 13. 6 strings. A wooden body. The only thing that never lied to him. Perhaps that's why millions still listen. Not because Eric Clapton played guitar better than anyone else. Plenty of musicians will argue that point. But because every note he played carried something you can't fake. Pain, hope, and the stubborn, reckless, irrational determination to keep going when every reason to stop was staring him in the face. The world called him God. He never believed it. Maybe the truth is simpler. He was just a broken man with a guitar, turning his damage into something the rest of us could hold. And somehow, that was enough.